Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon to this conference, Biafra and the Eastern Nationalities, who is in and who is out. This is a follow-up to the conference that we had on the 15th of January, which was the Igbo and Yoruba conference, speaking with one voice. It is part of a series of dialogues that the Fatherland Group is staging on the important issues as far as our country, Nigeria, is concerned. These conferences are not intended to be one-off exercises, but the beginning of a process, the beginning of discussion on the basis that dialogue and Jojo is better than war, which nicely brings us onto my role today. As you can see, I'm not a Biafran. I'm not an Easterner. And indeed, neither is Lara Oyedele, our timekeeper. But it is in the spirit of good neighborliness that was the formula by which our nations coexisted. That if there is trouble in my neighbor's house, then it is of concern to me as well. And helping to put out the fire is a civic social responsibility. And so we, the Yorubas, participating in this exercise, are grateful for the opportunity to try and act as mediators between our brothers and sisters in the East on these issues. Now, when you registered for the conference, you will have received a chronology that I drew up. Me as a historian, I took interest in these issues with a view to helping to try and get to the bottom of the acknowledged difficulties in the relationship between the Eastern nationalities. And that difficulty was illustrated by the fact that even when we were putting this conference together, and we originally titled it Biafra and the Eastern Minorities, there was loud and strong objection on the part of the so-called minorities, say we are not minorities, we are wholesome nations. And that forced us to change the program to what we now have, Biafra and the Eastern nationalities. So we're listening, and we should all be listening as a key to making progress. Now, I don't intend to go through that chronology. I just want to talk to some of the key dates. And you see, as a historian, I'm particularly interested in the external dimension, because very often when there is trouble in the house, if you look carefully enough, you may find that the roots of that trouble are actually to be found outside of the house. So I was very interested in the external dimension to the troubles. And the first date that I want to focus on is November 1908. This is when oil production began in southern Nigeria. Contrary to what we were told, that oil was discovered in Olibiri on 15th of January 1956, it was actually discovered well before that, 1908. So going forward, we have to understand that 1956 date, not as the date of discovery of oil, but the date of disclosure of that discovery. It had been discovered and was being enjoyed by somebody, but we were only told in 1956. And that is borne out by the fact that the oil was a key factor in the configuration, the political configuration of Nigeria. It was pivotal to the amalgamation of 1914, and it's central to all the divisions that were created in the South thereafter. The process of division began on my next key date, which was 1st of April 1939, April Fool's Day, 1939. Those of you who were there for the Igbo and Yoruba conference will recall that that was the date on which what had been one southern Nigeria, was partitioned into Eastern region and Western region by Governor Budilon. There had been no conflict between East and West. There had been no petition for that partitioning, either from the East or from the West. But it was all done towards the British agenda of ensuring northern control of the entity called Nigeria. And that required division in the South and unity in the North. So that fracturing of the Southern Nigeria identity created a stage for the disunity that we're concerned about at this conference. And you can understand it in this context, because it was at that point of division, from my research, that the Eastern nationalities, the non-Igbos, started feeling and at least expressing a concern of possible domination by the larger Igbo peoples. And you can get a sense of that from the Brexit scenario and events in Europe, because it is following Brexit that the Scots of Scotland feel a greater sense of possible domination by their English neighbours, in a way that they didn't feel it in quite the same way when they were part of the larger unit called Europe. So these are natural human reactions. Our next key date is 1941. This was the occasion of discussions between an Ijaw leader, Ernest Ikoli, and that same Governor Budilon that created a partition. And it was a discussion about further partitioning. This was the first discussion about the possibility of creating the southern states separate from the eastern states. And the next date is April 1947, which is when the first real crack in the wall of the eastern region appears, just as after Governor Richards accedes to the Ijaw Rivers People's League's request for a rivers province. This was the beginning of the campaign for a separate Calabar, Ogoja, and Rivers states. Our next date is May 1953. This is when the British colonial government amended the constitution to dissolve the Eastern Region House of Assembly to enable an Igbo man, Nnamdi Azikiwe, to displace Eyoita and Efik man as leader of the Eastern Region House of Assembly. And you can imagine the resentment that caused. I'm not going to go into the detail of the background to that dissolution. You'll find that in my book, A Fatherless People. But this is then followed on the 19th of April, 1954, by a meeting between Harold J.R. Wilcox and Action Group's Alfred Ruani. Action Group was led by Obafemi Awolowo, and it was really essentially the party of the Western region, the Yoruba peoples. But it was an early discussion at which Action Group pledges support for the creation of River State, which and later escalated to the creation of Calabar, Ogoja, and Rivers states. So you see that partition by Budilon created an opportunity for grievances and ambitions to be exploited by even my people, the Yoruba in the on the Western Divide. The widening divide was then compounded on 30th of July, 1958, when the Willink Commission, which was appointed by the British colonial government, listen to this, to inquire into the fears of minorities and the means of allaying them. The report ruled out the creation of new states, but declares Niger Delta a special area. So although Willing did not create new states in the eastern region, it nevertheless created that divide by the special treatment it recommended for the Niger Delta. And in line with the report's recommendation, the Independence Constitution, 1st of October 1960, provided for the establishment of the Niger Delta Development Board, which initiated a special economic development program in the Niger Delta areas exclusively. So you could see the divide that creates, a special development program for the Niger Delta to the exclusion of other parts of the East. And this was all parked under the authority of Prime Minister Balewa, a northerner. And so the plan saw the implementation of excellent schemes, agri, fisheries, infrastructure development schemes, with the aid of British and Dutch technical experts. So you can see how two ways of looking at the same administration will evolve. Niger Delta will look at the Balewa administration with fondness and approval, whereas the rest of the East might be looking at them in a very different way. Our next key date is August the 8th, 1963. This is when the Midwest region is created in the Western region, in the Yoruba space, following a motion that had been passed by the federal parliament the previous year. You see, what this development does, it accentuates the sense of grievance of those who in the Eastern region had been campaigning for the creation of the Calabar, Ogoja, and River states. So there's a Western region granting the creation of a Midwest state, and whereas in the Eastern region, their similar demands have been denied. The next date that I wish to talk about is 15th of January 1966. This was the day of the first military coup in Nigeria, resulting in the assassination of Balewa and Ahmadu Bello and the end of the NPC government. Now, when I was researching a fatherless people and the history of Nigeria, one issue that really stuck with me was, why was it that the Ijaw reacted in a different way to that coup as against other parts of southern Nigeria, which manifested in the declaration on the 23rd of February, 1966, of the Niger Delta Republic by Isaac Adakaboro, an Ijaw man. And we're going to be, we're fortunate that his nephew is one of the speakers today, and he'll be joining us soon. So that move, the declaration of the Niger Delta Republic in reaction to the first coup, I believe is attributable to the special development project that was under the control of the Balewa administration, with different treatments for different parts of the Eastern region. Relations in the Eastern region were further aggravated when on 24th of May 1966, the Aguiyi-Ironsi administration promulgated the Unification Decree, which had the effect of abolishing the regions and substituting a unitary and powerful central government. Now, you can imagine the reaction to that move by an Igbo leader of those who had been campaigning for the creation of Calabar, Ogoja, and River states, especially against the background of the creation of the Midwest states in the Western region. So the traffic, the political traffic, was going in completely the opposite direction from what the Eastern nationalities, the non-Igbo Eastern nationalities wanted. And so that's an important context. What then followed was the pogroms of 1966, 29th of May, 29th of July, and 29th of September, in which the Igbos in the north were slaughtered en masse. But of course, the Eastern nationalities were caught up in that as well, and many of them fell victim to the pogroms. Our next key date is May 1967. That's when the Gowon military government made two key moves, which deepened the division in the Eastern region. First, it released the Ijaw hero, Isaac Adakaboro, from jail. He then later joins on the federal side in the Biafra War. And then on 27th of May, a decree is issued dividing Nigeria into 12 states. It divided the eastern region into 3 states, with the core Igbo areas being contained in the new East Central State, thus fulfilling the long-standing aspirations of the Eastern Eastern nationalities for the creation of the Calabar, Ogoja, and River states. So all that they had been campaigning for all the while was now being granted by the Gowon administration in the creation of the 12 states. So again, the sentiments in the East will have been different in relation to that development. Let's now move to our final date, which is the 29th of September, 1979. This is 9 years after the end of the Biafran War, in which we were told there were no victors and no vanquished. But this was the day on which the Abandoned Properties Decree was published, having the effect of declaring forfeit properties belonging to Igbos in the Port Harcourt area, which were not at the date of the decree in the physical occupation of the Igbo owners. So this brings us now round to this conference today, 29th of May, 2021. We fixed this day for the conference because we found it curious that of all the dates on which the Republic of Biafra could have been declared, that the declaration was made not long after midnight on the 29th of May, a day of the month which figures, if you've been listening carefully, repeatedly in the chronology of the events by which the British plan for the North to rule Nigeria unfolded. So much so that even the secret, and it was marked secret, even the secret report of the Secretary of State for the Colonies to his cabinet colleagues on the Willink Commission report ahead of its publication. What was the date of that report? 29th of July, 1958. I end by reminding us all that, as Abraham Lincoln said, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and you may fool some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. I hope in this brief presentation that provides some context, at least on the external dimension, some context to the rivalries and the enmity that has been created and has subsisted in the Eastern region between the nationalities of the East, which the object of this conference is to help us to get over and to address. Thank you so much, Timothy Modu Jr., Timothy C. Modu Jr., son truly of his father. We heard culture as the software of our minds, that the British and not the Igbos colonized the Niger Delta, that common problems demand of cooperation for their solutions, that those problems do not stop at national borders. We heard that before the colonials, the nationalities of the East had systems and values in common. And it's those commonalities that we need to understand and build upon. And I was particularly pleased to hear, because it was missing from my chronology, about the role of the women of the South-South and the Southeast in what is commonly known as the Aba Women's Riot. It wasn't a riot, it was an uprising It was a revolution. It was a coming together in 1929 of the women of the East to face up to the colonials, leading the way for our menfolk who now took over in the campaign for independence. Let that never be forgotten. The lead role of our women. I always tell my fellow men that there's so much we can understand from our mothers, from our daughters, because they know that in the process of something we take for granted, we men take for granted, of producing the new generation, producing our children, producing the future, they know that there is pain in that process. They carry it for 9 months and they go into it with a happy heart, knowing that it will be painful and the disruption to their lives. But they make those sacrifices for a better tomorrow. There's a lot that we menfolk really need to understand, that there can never be gain without pain. And we don't need equal opportunities, women's liberation from the West narrative. It was always part of our way. We just have to open our eyes to see it. Again, thank you, Timothy Modu Jr., for those opening remarks. Thank you so much, Jite. Thank you. If this discussion was not warm before, it is now very, very hot indeed, demonstrating how high the passions are on this matter, which is understandable. When lives are being lost daily, when homes have been destroyed every minute, when fractured relations have not been mended through this kind of process, it is understandable that the passions will run high. But through it all, here are my pickups from Jite's presentation. He said, there is nothing like Niger Delta. That it's an artificial identity that was created by the British as part of their divide and rule strategy. That the nationalities of this area are the children of light. He said, we are not Nigerian by birth, but by force. It bears reflection. He went back to the theme that ran through his presentation, that at the heart of all this is divide and rule. And he illustrated that by explaining how even within the Niger Delta label, identity, there are issues and concerns of domination within that space as well, illustrating very clearly what we all need to take on board, that identity is like an onion. It has many layers. You peel one layer and there's another layer underneath. And very often what we're complaining about in our own space, where we feel the victims or we feel the threats, is often manifest within our very own space, if we look closely enough. And this dialogue is part of the process of hearing those concerns, because we as a peoples, despite the narrative that they pushed out, we have the brain power to understand. And once you have the brain power to understand a problem, you have the keys to the solution. It only requires honest, even if passionate discussion for us to really understand each other. And although he was tempted to use part of his allocated time for his neighbor and countrywoman, Priscilla, to come and respond to his comments. But I know that Priscilla was listening carefully. And she, as an Ogoni woman, will be saying her piece very, very shortly. So I want to thank Jite for his contribution. You really set the temperature of this very, very important discussion. Thank you, Keme. Subai, good luck, Keme. Thank you for that presentation, which lends such important context to the dichotomy, the enmity that exists between those who consider themselves Ijaw or Aizon, as he also describes it, and the Igbo nationality. Here's somebody who has two heroes, two fathers, who, if you look from a distance, it looks like an oxymoron. How can he be referring to Ojukwu as his father, and in the same breath be referring to Isaac Adakaboro, his uncle, as his hero, when it was Ojukwu who led the crushing of the 12-day revolution that was declared by his uncle, Isaac Adakaboro. It was a detail that I, as a historian, had lost sight of. And it's relevant in the context of the divide and rule framework of this discussion. How people are played against each other by third actors and invisible hands. It's with that context, you can fully understand why Ijaw people, as he said, the hatred of the Igbos has seeped down to their very bone marrow when they remember that their quest for freedom was not only stopped by an Igbo-led government under Ironsi, but the actual military action to crush that revolution within the Eastern region was led by the commander of the forces in the Eastern region, which was Ojukwu. But he's been able to see through, at least for himself, he's able to see through the poisoning of the relationships. And notwithstanding that, as an Ijaw man, to identify with the Igbos as what he sees as their path to liberation. Very, very important context. Thank you again, Subai, for that excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Priscilla. What a brilliant rendition. Fantastic. It goes to show that how important dialogue is. Have the conversation. When you have the conversation, you may see that the person who you thought has two heads and a tail between their legs is not such a monster after all, and that one's views are not that far apart. These of the many important points that Priscilla gave us, I understood that her Ogoni people are believed to have migrated from Ghana. I should be looking more closely at your features with a view to corroborating that fact. She spoke as a post-war child with sharing her insight into the war, largely handed down from the stories passed down from her relations who had direct experience. I loved what she said, that the contradictions, Nigeria is all about contradictions. She said from the constitution, contradictions, right down to how our regions are described, contradictions, causing confusion and conflict. She said, very importantly, our true history has been distorted. This is the root of our confusion and the troubles. And as a latter-day historian, I could not agree with her. I could not agree with her more. It is narrative, I've said recently, kills. The Hiroshima bomb killed hundreds of thousands of people. But narrative, loaded with lies and distortion, kills from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. So the importance of getting our story right and having this discussion between our peoples cannot be overemphasized. She said, I understand my name, Nwiko, not to be an Igbo name. I understand it as an Ogoni name. We've got to recognize that it is how the individual sees themselves. It's easy for a third party looking in to label us, but you cannot ignore how we see ourselves. And identity is at the roots of everything, is at the roots of how we relate to everybody else. And she said repeatedly that the difficulty that she has with the Biafra label is that we've never been asked about who we want to be. Somebody should speak to us. Her people, the Ogonis, like many other of the nationalities within Nigeria, it's not a unique experience. They've been packaged and bundled and labeled by other people pursuing their agenda. But they've never been asked who they are. How do you see yourselves? She mentioned the experience of domination and suffering of her people, the Ogoni people, and no doubt other Eastern nationalities, at the hands of Igbos during the war, cannot be run away from. In a war situation, there will be what the Westerners like to call collateral damage. Everybody becomes an object of suspicion, an object of fear, because you can't know who's on whose side, especially when third parties are playing one against the other. It's inevitable. One cannot deny that. She said there has to be admissions, there has to be acknowledgements, there has to be apologies, there has to be dialogue in order for us to move forward. She said fundamentally that although she believes in Nigeria as an entity, she acknowledges that the Nigeria state lacks, as it lacks equity. And unquestionably, that if there was equity, within the Nigeria entity, within its governance, there will be less agitation for separation. I think Odua nationalists will say yes to that, just as even the hardest core Biafrans will say yes to that. It is the inequity that was programmed into the Nigeria structure that is at the root of the agitation, justifiable agitation, to say if we will not be treated fairly, if we will be treated as a second-class citizen or ethnic group, then we'll rather be number one in our own small kingdom and in our own small world. No self-respecting peoples want to be regarded as inferior to everybody else. Rather be by ourselves, if that is the alternative. And it should concluded with, we've got to have the conversation. It's as simple as that. We've got to talk, just as we are doing. Iriawo, thank you so much for that. In Fatherland Group, rest assured that our men are alongside our women, and our women are alongside our men. We don't have one in front, one behind. We have them side by side. So your message is taken on board. Valuable presentation. I understood from that the Kalabari are eyes on people, and that Ijo is actually a corruption of the genuine name, which is eyes on. I understood from that you were Biafrans even before Nigeria came into existence in 1900. And that's a powerful message, reinforced by the illustration that the Presbyterian Church of Biafra predated what then became the Presbyterian Church of Nigeria. So this is evidence-led reasoning, and this is what Fatherland values, much more than emotional reactions to situations. We love it when we're evidence-led, reasoning-led, because our greatest gift as human beings that separates us from animals is the power of reason. We must never allow that to be handicapped as we shape our new relationship and the way forward. I heard that what Ojukwu proclaimed when he declared Biafra was actually what had been agreed, that it wasn't a unilateral action. It was an agreed declaration. I heard that Ngaji is a spoon, and this is common right across the Eastern nationalities. I probably murdered the pronunciation as a Yoruba man, but my wife will correct me later on. Ngaji is a spoon. It illustrates in the common thread, and which she explained very clearly, that there is a common thread running across the relationships in the East. And that common thread, as she said, it is actually the Igbo common thread, which is not surprising that there are interplays of nationalities. There will be exchanges. We were good neighbors before the colonial intrusion. This has to be remembered. So thank you again for that presentation. Very clear, great messaging from Iriawo. Taminu Tonye, thank you very much. Thank you, Insima, for that brilliant and powerful presentation. Really encapsulated by the statement of the very obvious, the staring us in the face, that Buhari was president before he was born. He's now 30 years of age. And here he is again with another term. And Nsima asks, when will it be my turn? He said that if you're not informed, you are deformed. But our comfort is that it is not a permanent deformation or deformation. It's curable. So what we don't know that's causing us to be deformed because we're uninformed is a form of deformity that's within our hands to correct. He said that they've distorted our history in order to conquer us. That is part of the deformed condition that we're all in. Deliberate distortion of history. And it is our responsibility to straighten that leg, straighten that arm by teaching ourselves and sharing knowledge. He mentioned how they've taken history off the syllabus, not to teach us and our children our history. What responsible state does that to their people? But again, it's in our hands. If they won't teach history because they want to keep us where we are, down where we are, then it is within our power to learn history and share that knowledge through this kind of dialogue and discussion. He said, we are all Africans at the roots, regardless of our individual genealogical path. He explained how his people of Akwa Ibom are being used as houseboys and boys all over. And he explained how that has happened through, and I love the expression, warrant governors who have taken over from the warrant chiefs. Now, for those of you who don't know, warrant chieftaincies were created by the British, particularly amongst the Igbos, where they could not find an amenable, ready-made, top-down command structure with chiefs such as they found in the north and to a lesser extent in the west, because they needed that top-down command structure in order for ease of interference. I wouldn't call it administration, ease of interference with our governance systems. So they created chiefs by warrant. And it's a beautiful equivalence. How those warrants chiefs, their loyalty were to their creators, their benefactors, rather than to their people, which was our way before the colonial intrusion. And he makes the analogy that the governors have allowed the degeneration of their people and the squandering of their human capabilities from generation to generation, because they too are looking upwards to their remunerators and their benefactors rather than looking down and across to their people and empowering them. And he explained that the demands of the new generation is simple. They want their freedom. And they want it via a referendum. Now, is that too much to ask? All through the presentations, the recurrent theme is the need for us to talk and to dialogue, to be listened to, rather than to be dictated to. So, Nsema, thank you for that very insightful presentation. Amen to that prayer, and thank you for that presentation, Chimi. When we were putting this conference together, there were some people who were saying, you're allowing IPOB people to speak, but does that not go to illustrate the importance of allowing people to speak, rather than prejudging and assuming that you know? It is good to talk, and intelligent minds will always be ready to listen. It doesn't matter how unpleasant what you may find what they have to say. Respond not with emotion, but with reason. We heard Biafra did not start in 1967. That identity, that label, it was not started by the Igbos. It was actually started, if anybody's to be, in inverted commas, blamed, it started 100 years before by the missionaries. The Presbyterian Church of Biafra was created not by Igbos, it was created in Calabar by, in my assessment, the British missionaries, but it was not an Igbo project. Interestingly, it was said that the Igbos were not consulted in being grouped under that label, which is a point that needs to be taken on board. It cannot be escaped. It was done by the people of Calabar, he said, and it was an Ijaw man, Frank Okigbo, who reminded Ojukwu of what had been done by the missionaries when the proclamation, and it was an agreed proclamation we've heard again, when the proclamation of Biafra, when they were looking for an identity, a name for what was to be the new republic and independent entity, that was the name. He explained that that Biafrans or IPOB do not believe any nationalities are minorities, that you cannot go into another man's land and become a majority in that person's land, that every nationality within the East is a nationality, and that includes the Igbos, each one equal to the other, that we're all equal partners within the area, the space that is called Biafra. We might use the expression, the geographical expression called Biafra, just like Nigeria is referred to as a geographical expression. He explained that the vision for Biafra is modeled on what we see in the United Arab Emirates, with Dubai having its own identity, and alongside Abu Dhabi and other such members of the UAE, the Emirates. Such is a loose union with each of the nationalities having their unique and enjoying their unique identity and self-expression. He pointed out that the irony about concerns that simply by virtue of the numbers of the Igbos relative to the other Eastern nationalities, the concern that that will be a recipe for domination, and points out the irony that it is a minority ethnic group, the Fulani, who are marginalizing majority ethnic groups, if one uses in terms of numbers. So numbers do not necessarily dictate who will marginalize and who will be marginalized. That the important thing is to have checks and balances within the relationship arrangements to guard against the risk of abuses. And in that context, they explain that what is visualized is that every group within the Biafra space that's recognizing that each one of them is capable of leadership, contrary to what we're seeing on the ground now, where it appears that it's only those who have the Fulani identity are capable and worthy of the high ground, as it were. That's recognizing that everybody has a capacity to lead, and that will be accommodated by a rotational arrangement. And then finally, what I picked up was that he said that any constitutional arrangement for that area would have and incorporate a right to leave, because if that right exists within the constitutional arrangement, then there's less likelihood of abuse once you know that there's a pathway for departure. It's like in a marriage, if everybody knows that the abused partner knows where the front door is, then you're more likely to treat them fairly and respectfully. It's ironic that Obasanjo, the general, who had 2 turns at the presidency, a bit like Buhari, had 2 bites at the cherry, that he had written in a book titled This Animal Called Man, which he wrote or had written for him before his second reincarnation, had said that any future constitution for Nigeria must contain a right of departure clause. For that very reason, he used the expression of the abused wife and the lesser risk of departure if that right exists. But of course, that was lip service. When he got there, he did absolutely nothing about entrenching that right. So Chimi, thank you for that presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Gabriel Eke. The closing message is the most powerful. We've got to improve our listening skills, our listening capacity. That is the key to getting over these problems that were created for us. He said, we must give every nationality that respect that they deserve. We must go back to what we were before. And he underlined that point by saying, we were governing ourselves as nations before the European colonialists came. People often forget that. They say, what will happen? How will we rule ourselves? How will we survive? But before 1900, how were we arranged? It was people and peoples governing themselves, finding their own leaders, their own way. He said, colonialism is a mixture of conquest and ethnic disrespect. And going forward, as we rebuild, because undoubtedly this thing has crashed, as we rebuild, we must eschew those instincts, those terrible instincts of conquest and ethnic disrespect. He said he wears 2 identities proudly. He's an Igbo man, and he's also Calabari. He said, as an Igbo man, he apologizes for the manifestations of the quest for domination shown towards other ethnic nationalities in the East. But beautifully and symmetrically, as a Kalabari man, the other side of him, he apologized to the Igbos for what his people and other, I dare say, smaller nationalities. In fact, let me stay away from the word small, because when we're in the context of relationship between nations, it is not numbers, but the entity. So other nationalities of the East, an apology to what they did and said to the Igbos, because undoubtedly in the midst of war, as I touched on earlier, is naive to think it was all one way. It is ignorance to assume that those who were benefiting from that conflict were not actually actively fanning the flames one against the other, sponsoring what they call in these days false flag operations, where one will wear the uniform of the other side and carry out these acts in order to poison the relationship. He said we need remembrance memorials for all we lost on both sides, because it was our collective loss. We need those memorials to show that we've learned something. He reminded us that when our people were doing great things in our homelands, for ourselves, by ourselves, before the Europeans came in, it was they who were in that uncivilized, barbaric state of mass warfare and killing of each other. I remind people that in my new book, A Slave Ship Called Jesus, that it was because of European experience accumulated and acquired from bloody wars, 100 years wars, 30 years wars. It was that experience, very recent experience, with innovations in the art of killing that enabled them to walk in and do what they did, from the slave trade right through to colonization. Yet the narrative was spun that we were the barbarians. What they actually exported to us was barbarism. This is why when you look at the state of the land now, it resembles the state of Europe at the time of that first interaction. He said that the issue for our people is a choice between autonomy and sovereignty. Sovereignty, we're freestanding nations, each and every one of us that were thrown into the sack of amalgamation. Autonomy, we're together, we have something resembling Nigeria, but one that respects each and every ethnic group. He said within the Biafran space that what he envisages is autonomous states having their own governance with a central commission. I mean, that very much resonates with the alternative constitution, the constitution for a restructured Nigeria, because everybody keeps saying, what restructuring? Most of those talking about restructuring do not know what it means. So they're all coming up with their different interpretations. Some saying, go back to 1963. Well, what does that mean? 1963 was a colonial arrangement. It wasn't an arrangement that we decided for ourselves without external interference. 1963 still had central control and exclusive control of the army and the police. rather than our peoples policing themselves. 1963 still had Northern majority control of the National Assembly. So what is going back to 1963? That's going back to a colonial arrangement. The Fatherland Alternative Constitution, or at least the one that we've adopted, is on the Fatherland website. For those who do not know, please visit it, fatherlandgroup.org. And it contemplates that very arrangement, whereby the nationalities, each is equal in value to the other, however large, however small, with a central commission, going back to the culture of good neighborliness, which Dr. Ekes summarized as collaboration of respect. Dr. Eke, thank you very much for that presentation. Thank you very much, Professor Philip Effiong, true son of his father, the military ruler, visionary. He spoke of invisible boundaries, artificial, and therefore they can be dismantled if we want to dismantle them. It is all about the will to do the right thing. The talk of it's impossible is nonsense. It spoke of the creation of southern Nigeria and northern Nigeria and the amalgamation which followed. That was an instrument of exploitation of our people and threw us into competition in place of the benign and peaceful coexistence and good neighborliness that characterized our relationships prior to that. We must never lose sight of that. He explained how the creation of 12 states branded the Igbos as the prime threats of domination in the eastern region. He explained how his father's younger brother was almost killed during the war, but for the intervention of Igbos who identified him as Philip Effiong's brother. He said we must reject the tendency to judge by overgeneralization from acts by individual actors, that every society has criminals. I put it always in the terms that every society has its mix of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And to deduce and generalize from the acts of the few and take that as the conclusive definition of the majority is a great sin. He pointed out, and this is what I particularly liked, that the states as created, as we know them, will only perpetuate conflicts. And why is that true? It is because when you look at the configuration of those states, they are designed just as the country boundaries in Africa were designed at the Berlin Conference. Not to respect the component nationalities, but to violate them. And so you find borders with members of the same ethnic group on either side of our state boundaries. We complain about the Berlin Conference and what the Europeans did to us in the mangling of the natural and historic relationships in Africa. But here are our own people similarly mangling the identities within the Nigeria space, deliberately and upon purpose, in order to facilitate exploitation and to maximize and promote conflict. So thank you for reminding us of that. And he said, what we need is civic education, a civic educational curriculum to promote better understanding. We need to know each of our histories. History is going to be a big subject in the new Nigeria. I always talk in terms of there's a new history war out there. The narratives that have been used to bring us to where we are not the narratives that we're going to go forward with towards a better tomorrow. Professor Effiong, thank you very much for that presentation. Thank you so much, my namesake. Many of you be wondering about this namesake references that Dr. Miyuko and I use to refer to ourselves. In mutual admiration, we agreed to swap names. But you will have heard, from what you've heard, you will have seen that I ended up with the better deal as between the two of us. A truly remarkable mind. He opened by saying, quoting Steve Biko, that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. Do not lend them your minds. Stop lending them your minds. Take ownership. Take it back. He said that with some useful suggestions for us, that those who have records, the Timothy Modu Juniors, the Philip Effiong Juniors, let Fatherland digitalize those records. He said, let's erect a memorial for Biafra. We must never forget. He reminded us of the enemy from within. Regrettably, our military that should be protecting us, that ought to be, if they have to shoot at all, it is to be shooting non-Nigerians. But regrettably, when you check their record, almost every bullet and every bomb, the receiver has been a Nigerian. That cannot be allowed to continue. He said we all deserve a better future. That is a given, but reminded us that the custodians of that better future are the youth. And so what we are on is a legacy project. It is not the pounds, shillings and pence or the naira and kobo that you will leave in your bank account or in your estate that will be the true legacy for your children. It will be a better country, a fairer country, a more peaceful country, a more progressive country. So all of those who are concerned about accumulating wealth, what use is that when your children cannot live in their country, travel in their country with assurance, with peace in their minds? He said, let's celebrate our diversity. We keep resenting diversity rather than embracing and celebrating it. We go further to deny it in the pretense that we're all one. But what has come through today is that we are indeed diverse, but there are commonalities. So let's celebrate the diversity. He reminded us we have to go back to the African way. And what was the African way? Valuing human life. The African way, we didn't take lives casually. Contrary to the narrative that we were always killing ourselves, it wasn't our way. I remind people, what were we killing ourselves for? Is it more mangoes that we can't eat them all, or pineapples, or yams? Is it more of our beautiful women folk when we have so many? What were we killing ourselves for, according to their narrative? It wasn't our way. We valued human life. He said we must rewrite the curriculum. And Fatherland can do that, he said. not only for Nigeria, but also for Africa. And I particularly liked his points that nothing is irreconcilable if the will is there. And within Fatherland, that the will is most definitely there. Thank you so much. Such moving words, moving reflection. Let us never forget. And most importantly, let us never forget what I say. And indeed what Professor Effiong said, the danger of generalizing from the few to the many, and remembering that amongst us, there are good people in every ethnic group and bad people in every ethnic group. And we must try harder to separate the good from the bad and from the ugly. Thank you very much, Joe. You've spoken on behalf of the good people of Britain. I know that you will take the message back that the Fatherland Group is not anti-British. We're only anti the bad Britons, and we will never shy away from calling them out when we see them. As we always say, if we see it, we will say it. That's the Fatherland philosophy. Now, let me close this conference with just a few bullet points. It has been a long day. When the real history is known, not the contrived history that they are writing, and that some of our people regrettably are perpetuating, the real history, it will be known that the Biafra War was one of the greatest evils that was done by man against man. Over and above even the slave trade. Through this conference, we heard how many of the parentages or the parentage are mixed within the East. We heard many mixed and diverse views in relation to Biafra and the way forward. The important thing is that we heard them, we listened. We noted that they take history off the syllabus, but we say if they won't teach history, we must learn history. It's in our hands. We heard from Insima that Buhari was there before he was born 30 years ago. And he's back again. And he said, when will it be my turn? We heard that Biafra did not start or was not started with by the Igbos. That label, that geographical expression started with the Presbyterian Church of Biafra as far back as the 1840s, 1850s. We spoke of colonial masters, as we often in error do, because there's a lot of language that they embed in our minds. Masters indeed, let's change the language. Colonial intruders, not masters. These are colonial intruders, trespassers upon our trajectory. We heard about the example of what was labeled as the Aba women's riots, but which we now understood and understand as the women of the East, their uprising against the abuses of the colonial intruders, and the example that our women set then, and the example that our women can provide today. I hope following this conference, which Fatherland has staged, and which you've done me the honor as a Yoruba man to anchor with a view to better relations between our brothers and sisters in the East, that you will see that we, the Yorubas, are enemies of none. We do not invade, we have no territorial ambitions against any others. We love peace and not war, and we will help to make peace. In fact, when we fight, it tends to be, we fight fellow Yoruba rather than others. But again, there's a deeper history behind that. I know that the catalogue of wars within the Yoruba space was instigated by the very same colonial intruders. Most of all, I want you to love the Fatherland Group. This is a beginning. This is not a one-off. We will be mending the broken fences. We hope soon to stage a dialogue between the southern Nigerians and the northern Nigerians. In the same way as we have staged dialogue between the Yorubas and the Igbos, and now within the and between the Eastern nationalities. Now, we're now going to move to more relaxed issues, and to perhaps introduce that, I remind you that the Champions League final, for those who follow football, is starting in about an hour, and our maestro DJ Bonnie will entertain us with music to take us to that final. But note this, that this final is between two English clubs, two parts of England, Chelsea in London and Manchester City in Manchester. It is dark blue against light blue. But what is common is blue. And that really touches on what this conference is all about. That what we have in common, what the nationalities of the East have in common. But instead of deadly rivalry and competition, we want positive, constructive engagement and competition. So I want to thank you all, those of you who've attended this conference, both by registering and those watching by the live streaming on YouTube. The videos will be available on our website as soon as we can complete the packaging and processing. And those who have been watching on YouTube, I want to thank you all. I want to thank the speakers, Timothy Modu Jr., Jite, Subai Good Luck Kemi, aka Nobleman, Iriawo Tamunu Tonye. Thank you again to Insima. Thank you to Priscilla Inwoko, to Chimi Ezigbo, Professor Philip Effiong, Dr. Gabriel Eke, Joe Williams, the Good Britain, and the patron of the Fatherland Group from South Africa, Dr. Biki Minyuku. And I thank in advance our man DJ Bonnie, who will now take us through with great entertainment, his best tracks, take us through to the Champions League final. Enjoy. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.